Hello! Welcome to Crash Course Mythology. Today we're going to start our three-part series on Greek, Norse, and Roman mythology by going over Greek mythology. Now, when people think of Greek mythology, they might be thinking of Disney movies or Percy Jackson or American gods. But just like Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology didn't come from a single source. So today we're going to look at some of its main literary and archaeological sources. Let's begin with literary sources. As much as possible, ancient Greeks preferred to pass down their myths orally. In fact, it wasn't until the 7th century BCE that someone named Homer composed oral poetry about the Iliad and the Odyssey. And even then, those poems were based on older, already existing traditions. In the Archaic period, bards known as rhapsodes would travel around reciting these myths. But later, as literacy became more common, poets would write them down. Hesiod was one of the first poets to write about Greek mythology in written form, in his Theogony and his Works and Days. He presents a thoroughly theocentric worldview in which the gods are clearly superior to mortals and also very much like humans. His stories, however, were based on older traditions, and he himself says so. There were many other poets who wrote about Greek myths, such as Stasinus, whose lost play about the Theban cycle may have been the basis for Aeschylus's trilogy Oresteia, or Panniarius, who wrote a lost epic poem about the Argonautica, which was probably the basis for Apollonius's epic poem on the same subject. The lyric poet Sappho also wrote about Greek mythology, but her poems are mostly lost, and the few surviving fragments don't contain any explicit mythological narratives. The lyric poet Alcman is the author of a hymn to Zeus, but again, it's likely that he too was working with older material. The same is true of the 7 surviving hymns in the Homeric hymn. While Homer is credited with these hymns, most scholars attribute them to a group of poets active between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE. Another major source for Greek mythology is the so-called epic cycle. These are a series of 4th century BCE poems, which were likely recited at festivals honoring the god Pan. Unfortunately, again, they are all lost except for small portions of one poem called the Cypria, which tells the story of the origins of Aphrodite and the Trojan War. There are also a few epitaphs or brief poems inscribed on gravestones that tell mythological stories, but there are only about a dozen of these. Later, during the Hellenistic period, Greek writers began collecting and organizing the myths into handbooks, like the one attributed to Pseudo-Apollodorus, which contains a genealogical list of the gods and heroes, or the anthology called the Bibliotheca, which is actually a collection of various myths from different sources compiled by a writer named Athenaeus. One thing to notice about these two works is that they are both anonymous, which indicates how far removed these writers are from the original oral tradition. During the Roman period, writers like Ovid and Hyginus wrote similar handbooks about mythology for their Roman audience. Now, if you want to learn more about any of these literary sources, we'll have links to all of them in the description. But outside of these literary sources, we also have archaeological sources. Most of these come in the form of vase paintings and other artifacts showing scenes from Greek mythology. While it's difficult to know exactly what these images would have meant to the people who made or used them, especially since vases were often made to be buried with their owners and thus had no context to help us interpret them, scholars have found many recurring motifs. For instance, Athena is frequently depicted with a snake or a bird, Poseidon with a trident, Hades with a caduceus, and Demeter with grain. It's also interesting to note that Greek mythology often served as inspiration for vase painters to make up their own narratives, meaning that our understanding of Greek mythology has been enriched by these artistic creations. Next, let's survey the history of Greek mythology itself. According to Hesiod's Theogony, the origins of the world can be traced back to chaos, from which Gaia or Earth sprung forth. Next came Uranus, or Sky, who mated with Gaia to produce the first gods, the Titans. Then came the 5-way race of gods called the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, both of whom were imprisoned in the great cavern of Gaia and Uranus. When Uranus refused to let go of the last monster born from Gaia and him, a titan named Cronus castrated him and threw his severed genitals into the sea. This event brought forth the goddess Aphrodite. Then comes the war between the Titans and the Olympians, led by Cronus's youngest son, Zeus. After Cronus swallowed each of his children to prevent them from overthrowing him, Zeus went to see his father, tricked him into vomiting up his siblings, then took his place on Mount Olympus. From here, the gods divided the universe among themselves. Poseidon received the seas, Hades received the underworld, and Zeus received the sky and the earth. But there were still monsters left on the earth, so Zeus and his siblings slew Typhon, the last monster. This victory firmly established the sovereignty of the Olympians over earth and sea. At this point, Zeus began his affair with the Theban princess Semele, who bore him a son, Dionysus, but was killed by Zeus's godly lightning. Zeus then impregnated his half-sister Demeter while in disguise as a stallion. She gave birth to Persephone, who was taken away by Hades, much to her mother's dismay. Meanwhile, Zeus impregnated the Titan goddess Leto, but she could not find anywhere to give birth. So the goddess Eileithyia was sent to assist her, and she gave birth to the twins, Artemis and Apollo. These are just a few of the myths that Hesiod retold in the Theogony. Another important myth recounted in the Theogony is the story of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. Now that the gods and humans were no longer separated by a wide chasm, the gods were easily able to interact with humans, and many of the myths from this point forward involve interactions between the two groups. One way that these myths have been organized is by age. We have the Age of the Gods, which begins with the Titanomachy, continues through the stories of the Olympian gods interacting with mortals, and concludes with the Trojan War. Then there's the Age of Heroes, which begins with the labors of Hercules and ends with his death. Finally, there's the Heroic Age, which begins with the Trojan War and ends with the return of Odysseus. Some of the most famous heroes from Greek mythology include Hercules, son of Zeus, and a Theban princess, Alcmena, who slew the Nemean lion and completed 12 nearly impossible tasks known as the labors of Hercules. His descendants, the Heraclidae, were involved in the Persian and Trojan wars, as well as founding colonies in the West. Then there are the descendants of Perseus, like Helen of Sparta, whose beauty launched 1,000 ships to Troy, or Heracles' cousin Theseus, who slew the Minotaur in the labyrinth. But now we're going to talk about two of the most famous groups of heroes. Heracles' cousins, the Argonauts, who sailed to Colchis to retrieve the Golden Fleece, and the house of Atreus, which includes figures like Atreus, his sons, Thyestes and Agamemnon, and his grandsons, Menelaus and his brother, the unfortunate Theseus. The deeds of the house of Atreus were the subject of several distinct cycles of related myths. There's the Mycenaean cycle, which covers the stories of Atreus, Thyestes, and their descendants, the Atridae. Then there's the Theban cycle, which covers the story of Oedipus and his descendants. And finally, there's the trilogy of Thebes, which covers the story of the 7 against Thebes, as well as Jason and Medea. Perhaps the best-known story from Greek mythology is the Trojan War, which was fought over the abduction of Helen by the Trojan prince Paris. The war is covered in Homer's Iliad and the Cypria, as well as in a lost epic poem called the Iliad. The war ended with the ruse of the Trojan horse, which resulted in the sack of Troy. The aftermath of the war is covered in Homer's Odyssey and other poems. Some of the heroes from the Trojan War include Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, Ajax the Greater, and Ajax the Lesser, both of whom were slain by Poseidon after the war, and Odysseus known for his cunning, including the trickery he used to defeat the suitors trying to force Penelope to marry one of them. Now, while Homer's poems are considered to be the height of archaic Greek literature, they also show the beginnings of a change in conception of the Greek pantheon. While earlier poets tended to depict the gods as anthropomorphic beings who interacted closely with mortals, Homer tended to present the gods as less interventionist and more concerned with their own affairs. This tendency to present the gods as aloof continued throughout classical Greek literature. During the classical period, philosophers like Xenophanes and later Plato argued that the traditional myths were never anything more than stories that were created by humans to explain natural phenomena. They also tried to argue against the traditional anthropomorphic view of the gods, suggesting instead that the godhead is beyond human comprehension. During the Hellenistic period, Greek rationalism reached new heights with writers like Plutarch and Pausanias, who both explored the ways in which the pagan gods could be interpreted allegorically and the ways in which they could express universal truths about the human condition. Both authors also worked to synthesize Greek and Roman religion and mythology. As we move into the Roman period, we see a lot of syncretizing of deities between Greece and Rome. For instance, Aphrodite was identified with the Roman goddess Venus, and her son Eros was identified with the Roman god Cupid. We also see the deification of emperors like Augustus and divine couples like that of Romulus and Remus, who were suckled by a she-wolf. Finally, as we move into the modern era, we see new interpretations of Greek mythology, including the anthropological approach pioneered by people like Lord Raglan and his classic, The Hero of a Thousand Faces, which explores common characteristics of the hero found in mythology from around the world. Carl Jung's theories of the collective unconscious also influenced modern understandings of mythology. Later, scholars like Bruno Bettelheim explored the psychological functions of fairy tales and myths in his work, The Uses of Enchantment. More recently, scholars have begun exploring alternate origin theories, like that of Maria Gimbutas, who argued that the Greek pantheon was originally matriarchal in nature and that the patriarchal takeover is reflected in myths like the Titanomachy. Others, like Walter Burkert, argue against this interpretation and suggest that there's no evidence for a matriarchal society in Mycenaean Greece. Whatever the case, we do know that Greek mythology was full of hundreds of motifs that have inspired artists and writers in Western cultures ever since. Some of these motifs include Persephone's journey to the underworld, the destruction of Troy, the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and the labors of Hercules. Anyway, those are just some of the major aspects of Greek mythology. In the next part of our series, we'll dive into Norse mythology and all it has to offer. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps out.